The topic of the second session is linking ICT policy and regulation with Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as they are fondly described, and inclusive growth. What must be done differently to alleviate obstacles to universal connectivity and accessibility? To discuss this very topical subject, I have a strong panel, and I was just observing that these are all multi-country, multi-context people that we have. Natasha Beschorner, I first met, I think, in Fiji, because that is, she works in the hardest places, the Pacific Islands, where connectivity is a huge challenge. She's a senior ICT policy specialist. Dr. Siope Vakataki Ofa is the Economic Affairs Officer of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. He is originally from Tonga, and again brings a very interesting perspective, because ESCAP in the last 4 or 5 years has become more active in connectivity issues, and in particular is promoting the Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway, which is intended to improve the data connectivity and remove some of the barriers that are standing in our way. Dr. Bashir Ahmad Shadrach, fondly known as Shadi, is the Asia coordinator for the Alliance for Affordable Internet. This is a worldwide organization working on disseminating good practices in policy and regulation to make the internet affordable, as their name says. And his current focus is Myanmar, though he lives in India. And Dr. Syed Ismail Shah is the chairman of the Pakistan Telecom Authority, with extensive experience in multiple countries, Australia, and of course, being in South Asia, we have a lot of interactions between the South Asian regulatory agencies. So what you'll hear in this session is not so much a recitation of what is going on in particular countries or particular sectors, but a more free-ranging discussion on common topics of interest. So in setting up this topic, I was thinking that this is appropriate, that we look at the SDGs, which now I have behind me, because this is the transition point. Up to last year, we were talking about the Millennium Development Goals, some which were achieved and some which were not. But now we are talking about Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. There are more than 160 individual targets. And this is, in fact, posing a significant challenge. How do we actually measure where we are now and whether we are making any progress or not? So as I was thinking about it, I was reminded of one of the early invitations, I think it was last year, that came from ESCAP, where they wanted us, because we were working on data analytics and big data. Let me just briefly put a bracket here. I didn't introduce myself. I'm with LIRNEasia, which is a regional think tank that has been working on conventional policy and regulatory issues. As a former regulator, I have some expertise and experience in that area. But now we have moved into using mobile big data, mobile call detail records, to bring insights for urban planning, epidemiology, socioeconomic monitoring, and things of that nature, using the extraordinary potential of big data that the Mexican regulator repeatedly referred to in the previous session. So we were brought in to talk about what contributions we thought could be made in terms of measuring uh, performance, measuring progress with regard to SDGs by ESCAP. They were very early in this conversation. I was also looking at, I just Googled, as everybody does when they're given a topic, ITU, not ITU, I just put SDGs, ICTs, Information Communication Technology. And one of the very first items to be thrown up by the search engine was the ITU statistical arm, talking about how they could take responsibility for the measurement of certain indicators. But the larger question really is the role of ICTs going to be limited to measurement? Without question, I don't think we'll be able to do much with measuring ICTs without exploiting the potential of the data revolution, as the UN likes to call it, because these are extraordinarily rich indicators. We can talk about how many people are moving into a city, at what time. We can do extraordinarily granular, derive extraordinarily granular insights for urban planning. We can talk about poverty measurement in ways that have never been done before using these technologies. But the issue really is that whatever can be done in the developed world, where everybody is connected, or pretty much everybody is connected, cannot be directly done in our country. So if you imagine analyzing bank records, using big data from banking information, it won't work very well when you have 80–90% of your people unconnected or unbanked. The only thing which has got almost universal connectivity is the mobile of the electronic, which generates what we called datafied records. So obviously we need to connect. We need to have people using these electronic networks if we are to achieve the objectives set out by the UN through its report called the Data Revolution, to contribute to the measurement of SDGs. But then the larger question is it possible for ICT, policy and regulation, to make more direct contributions? Can we help achieve the objectives set out here? No poverty, sustainable infrastructure, agricultural value chains where waste has been reduced by half. These are the kinds of things that the world's leaders through the UN system have now agreed on. So what can we do to help contribute to this? Again, as a research organization, I went back to the research. We have, over the last 3–4 years, done several systematic reviews. That is, if I were to summarize it, to sort of like literature reviews on steroids, where you spend an enormous amount of time, you use very, very rigorous procedures, allow for replicability, have external peer review from the very moment of designing the research. But what you're doing is you're taking all the world's research that has been done on a topic, and you're seeing what is the most robust and the most solid findings that exist on a particular topic. So, for example, we have completed work on the effect of mobile networks on rural livelihoods. We have completed work on the effects of mobile financial services, on which many, many studies have been done mostly in Africa, and how they affect savings, how they allow poor people to reduce the volatility in their income streams, how they allow them to be more robust. All these kinds of work has been done. So, looking at the research, I can say that quite a number of these things will be helped by connecting people, by what we in this room, industry, government, regulators, academics, do. By connecting, simply connecting, we will help achieve many of the SDGs. But then the bullet points that were given to me also talk about innovation. Can ICT policy and regulation foster innovation, create the conditions for innovation. It talks about resilience. What we have seen is that while many of the world's poor are climbing out of poverty through their sheer grit and the use of new technologies and innovation, a shock, disasters, economic crisis, these shocks can pull them down again. Are we creating the conditions for resilience? Are we taking resilience into account in our work? These are some of the questions that I hope our panel will address. So at the bottom line, to summarize, what we need to do is to get, is it enough to do what I would call the necessary action or the necessary condition, which is to get everybody connected to electronic networks and bring them into the digital world? Is that what ICT policy and regulation is about? Or is there something more that we can do in terms of innovation, resilience, trust building, security, things of that nature? These are the broad questions that I am setting forth for our 4 panelists. And since we have about 80 minutes left, what I would think we'd do is leave about 30 or 40 minutes for interactions with you and have a quick round of 5-minute interventions on the key points that they wish to address from the panel. I will begin with Natasha.
Thank you very much, and thanks also to IIEC for inviting me to this conference. I'm from the Transport and ICT Global Practice at the World Bank, and our involvement in ICT is really focused on 3 broad areas. So I'll just talk about these a little bit, just to give you some more context of what the World Bank is doing in this space and why we're here. So broadly speaking, our engagement on ICTs focuses on 3 main pillars. One is, of course, digital connectivity. So helping through our projects, through funding, through regulatory advice to our client governments to close the broadband access gap. And that remains for a number of our countries in this region, notably in the lower income countries and the Pacific Islands, a very important goal. So filling that connectivity gap. The second area is digital innovation, and it's a very large area with potentially many ramifications and implications for the Sustainable Development Goals. Because here we touch on issues such as digital economy, enablers of the digital economy, and it goes certainly well beyond the narrow realm of traditional support for ICT and ICT-enabled services. So in this particular area, we do collaborate quite a lot with our team's working on, for example, trade and competitiveness issues, macroeconomic management and finance, legal and regulatory reforms, particularly in those legal areas that in many of our client countries are still very much underdeveloped, legal protections for electronic transactions in particular. And then the third broad strategic area where we're involved is on digital platforms. Again, a big topic, but one that interfaces with many of these SDGs, ranging from delivery of public services at the national level or subnational level to e-health, e-education, and areas such as road safety, intelligent transport systems, and so on. So our goals as an institution, and we are mandated to support efforts to end absolute poverty and promote shared prosperity. So those are our twin goals as a development organization. And every project that we fund, has to demonstrate how it addresses those particular goals. So how do we engage? We engage mostly through project finance to our client governments, and developing country governments, and the type of funding depends very much on, it depends entirely on the demand from the client, the balance of projects and development needs that they have. And the type of funding instrument could be straight investment, or it could be, for example, budgetary support linked to certain outcomes. We also support our clients on a more modest scale through analytical and advisory work. most of that is targeted to specific countries, but then we also every year produce a World Development Report, which this year was actually on digital dividends, and many of you may be familiar with that particular report. So just briefly, just a quick overview of this region, since we're in East Asian Pacific. So in East Asian Pacific, we're on the connectivity side, we're working very actively with mainly with the Pacific Islands to help get them connected in a kind of no island left behind scenario. So we're helping many of our government clients, in some cases together with industry partners and co-financing, to get connected through submarine cables and in some cases through satellite connectivity to bring down the price of access. In other countries, Myanmar, for example, we've been working with the government on a fairly comprehensive program of telecom sector reform, and that is likely to lead to a next phase of involvement on helping to facilitate a digital Myanmar. Mongolia, very briefly, we're working with the government there on a Smart Mongolia project to support government digital platform. And then in the middle income countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and prospectively others, there the interest is more on how ICTs are used on the digital platform side, how to deal with problems of road safety and congestion, for example. I mean, one case I'd like to mention is open traffic, where we're actually collaborating with a regional ride-sharing company, Grab, which also operates here, but we're collaborating with them in the Philippines and Malaysia at the moment to do large-scale data analytics to monitor traffic congestion and road safety in a few cities. So we see ICT is very much embedded in our particular mandate as a global practice, but also integral to the success of many other projects and programs that support these goals. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of these points later. Thanks.
Now I'd like to invite Dr. Siope, Vakataki.
Thank you, Rohan. Thank you very much for ICC for inviting ESCAP to be part of this important conference. For those of you who may not be aware of ESCAP, ESCAP is the regional arm of the United Nations here in Asia and the Pacific. It has about 62 member countries that ranges from Turkey to Kiribati in the Pacific. We deal with the economic and social development issues in these countries. In trying to align my first intervention with the main theme of this session, which is ICT and its contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. To begin with, perhaps I can provide some figures out there that are available that should help us and guide us to remind us what the state of ICT in the region is. As a first point, it is well known that ICT is a very important enabling tool for economic growth in the region. On average, broadband connectivity has improved in Asia-Pacific countries from about 3% penetration rate in 2005 to about 9% in 2015. For mobile broadband connectivity, significant improvement has been experienced in Asia-Pacific countries from 5% penetration rate in 2009 to about 39% in 2015 on average. 7 Asia-Pacific countries are among the top 20 countries in terms of overall ICT readiness in the Network Readiness Index according to World Economic Forum. We find that 3 of the Asian Pacific countries, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, are among the top 10 economies in e-commerce readiness in the world, according to a UNCTAD report. Korea, Australia, and Singapore were ranked as the world top 3 e-government leaders, according to a UN government survey in 2014. The Republic of Korea was ranked first, followed by Hong Kong, China, and Japan in the ICT Development Index. So all of these numbers are showing that there has been a lot of improvement in Asia-Pacific countries in terms of ICT. However, digital divide continues to widen. Performance varies significantly across Asia and the Pacific countries. There are 20 countries in Asia Pacific which have less than 2% broadband internet penetration. There are several countries with missing fiber optic links in Asia and the Pacific. There are still countries in the region which still have high broadband connectivity prices. The increase in fixed broadband subscription follows, we find that it follows, it depends a lot on income levels. So we find countries with are better off, higher income countries have better broadband subscription penetration and vice versa. So as a start, so the point is, in order for the private sector and to grow and contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals and to develop, be innovative in these countries, they need to connect first. This is more critical in Asia-Pacific countries that needs it the most. These are countries which are least developed countries, these are landlocked countries, and these are small island countries. One of the initiatives that we promote at ESCAP is this Asia-Pacific Information Superhighway, which is pushing for regional broadband connectivity among Asia-Pacific countries, which try to identify these missing links and push for countries to connect. But I'll stop here, Rohan, and perhaps give opportunities for others to contribute.
Thank you. I think we are seeing some common threads emerging. He referred to the need for international backhaul to be paid attention to. I think this is one of the priorities for the World Bank, as Natasha mentioned. We'll pick up on some of these themes as we move along. Dr. Shadrach, would you like to make your comments?
Thank you, Dr. Samarajiva. Thank you, IIC, for inviting the Alliance for Affordable Internet to be present in this August gathering. Thank you, Dr. Shah, for sensitizing us to focus our attention on the SDGs, because the topic was aptly so. Although there are only two targets which are directly targeting the access and expansion of access in the SDGs, the target 9C and 5B. 9C refers to the LDCs. By 2020, all the LDCs were to be connected. And 5B refers to opportunities through ICTs for women, in particularly in enhancing their capabilities and capacities to perform, because it's widely and universally recognized that women in business and women in other streams of engagement, formal and non-formal employment, but also domestic and agriculture work, contribute much more than men. So this is an underlying principle of the SDGs. But that said, we do recognize that the Sustainable Development Goals can leverage from the expansion of ICTs in the area of health, education, agriculture, environment, and also gender-related, of course, financial inclusion was mentioned earlier, trade and competition as well. But directly, when you look at the 17 goals, you have a larger scope for providing for these sectors to be improved so as to contribute to the larger ecosystem. That said, the digital dividend report of the World Bank clearly recognizes three things. One is the digital technologies have expanded the information base. There is more information about people and the planet with the humanity today as compared to a few years ago. The digital technologies have also lowered the information costs. The cost of accessing information used to be extremely high, but there are opportunities for us to access information at a lower cost, but also the digital technologies, as per the World Bank, have enhanced or created new information products. And we know that there are a number of products. Earlier we heard about platforms and applications, but there are quite a few good products that have come out. What we have not seen yet is the scale of big data and data analytics leading to producing products that are contextualized and localized, meeting the specific needs of communities. We have global products. Facebook is one example of how they use data to provide opportunities to people to access, but also for other advertisers and others to target their customers. But that said, we have not seen localization of information products as much we would want to. Having said that, the Alliance for Affordable Internet believes that cost is a major factor for people who are not able to access the internet. More than half of the population has not been able to take advantage of the internet. If you talk about the broadband access, we still have 6 billion people not having access to the broadband. The only area that we have improved is coverage. Only 400 million people in this planet do not have coverage, which means almost 7 billion people have coverage. But on the contrary, you have 6 billion people do not have broadband access. And we believe that the targets of the UN Broadband Commission is to be challenged. And with that ambition and attention, we would like to promote new targets to broadband, whether it is the speed, whether it is cost of measurement, but also disaggregated data to look at inequalities within communities. So if you look at the base of the pyramid within the developing and emerging economies, a large number of people are not able to access the internet due mainly to the factor of cost. So that's an objective of the Alliance for Affordable Internet put together by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web. Now, the way that we want to approach this is by not just having a dialogue with the industry and the government, but also bring into the mix the think tank, the civil society organizations, the academia and the media, and if possible also the larger grassroots organizations as well. So as an alliance, we welcome big and small organizations to join us. We have people like Google, Facebook, USAID, DFID, the governments and others supporting us, but also local institutions, local organizations as members of the alliance. So we form coalitions within various countries. As Dr. Samarajiva mentioned, we are engaged in Asia and Myanmar. We put together a national coalition of actors emerging from the government, the private sector, the to-be regulators, the larger industry, the civil society entities, and also the media, to look at issues. And we work essentially, because we target costs, we work essentially on certain targets such as taxation and tariffs, universal access, because in Myanmar there is already an intended approach to creating an universal access fund. So we would like to ensure that the past failures and learnings are incorporated into designing this fund, but more so in a multi-stakeholder manner where the civil society has a voice to contribute but also engage in the decisions of how this fund would be created. But also we focus on infrastructure sharing and as I mentioned earlier, data and research, which is quite predominantly important for us in order for the government and the telecom industry and other stakeholders to take informed decisions, not only to reach the unreached, but also to be efficient and engage in a process that's very helpful. So that's how we operate in various countries. We also publish something called the affordability report each year. Last year we looked at 51 countries. Although 21 of the 51 countries that we looked at, emerging and developing, have met the UN broadband targets, we believe that our research shows not a single country has been able to reach the target when it comes to the base of the pyramid, the poorest of the poor. So almost all countries have failed to reach the broadband targets, and the target itself is quite liberal, I would say, if it is 50% per capita, as the standard. We also look at mobile networks and mobile services to see how various innovations and new approaches have impacted communities, whether it is zero-rated services or the new forms of providing services. We do recognize that many of these are new innovations, and we would like to continue to focus on these issues. So I stop there by underlining the fact that although as per the World Bank's digital dividend report, we have achieved to a great extent some success, the dividends of the digital technologies have not been realized yet. The dividends ought to be realized only when we put in systems in place, the governance right, what they call the complementarities to the technology domain. The complementarities in terms of policy and regulation and governance supporting the technological innovation. Only then we would be in a position to achieve or realize what they call the digital dividend.
Thank you, Dr. Shatraj. 7 of the 7 billion people in the world, 6 billion don't have broadband. That's debatable, but let's discuss it. Dr. Shah, how many of this 6 billion are you responsible for?
Well, our total population is about 190 million, so, but we do have a big percentage in terms of this 190 million who are still not connected. But before I talk about this topic, let me just briefly mention what Pakistan Telecommunication Authority is. PTA was established in 1996. We were the 53rd regulator in the world. With this ex officio position, I also sit on the Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority, on the Universal Service Fund Company, the Frequency Allocation Board, and the National ICT Research and Development Fund Company. If you look at the SDGs now, coming back to the topic, the 17, and then you have these 116 individual tasks. This gives you the bigger picture, which we generally don't look at. Even as a regulator, we also sometimes, we look at, but sometimes we forget about the bigger picture, which is what the ICTs can actually do to bring about a positive change in the lives of the people. Because we are stuck daily with issues where we have to do this firefighting and resolve different issues. Now, if you look at all these things, the first thing that you need, SDGs, of course, is much more than just the connectivity, but connectivity is an important part. And if you look at connectivity, what are the sub-parts of this connectivity debate? So if we start from the customer side, the consumer side, the citizen side, the first thing is the device, which mostly in our case is wireless nowadays. Even the PCs or the laptops are wirelessly connected through Wi-Fi or through some other 4G or 3G technology, which brings us to the last mile then, which is actually one of the major issues in many of the countries, whether it is wireless. So if it's wireless, we have to auction or give out the spectrum at a high cost. If it is wired, fiber optic, fiber to the home, then we have this cost related to the right of way that makes it difficult for the fiber to be laid and eventually the service provided to the people. Then we have within the country the long haul fiber, and I think at least in our case we are doing well in that respect, but still there is a lot of work to be done in the underserved areas. And then we have the cross-border fiber links, and then the submarine cables, and then satellite and other platforms that are now emerging to serve those communities that are too remote to be served. But this is only the supply side. You are making accessibility, which may not be affordable for many people, but at least the access part would be there if you are able to resolve all these issues, and they have multiple issues of their own if you look at them. What about the supply side? Okay, so what are these people going to use this internet for? Just for entertainment? Or are they going to have some services, especially the government services? What type of contents can they develop? And I think if you look at SDGs, probably you can think of many services that can be developed using, if there is availability, if there is connectivity. If you look at some of these, although as rightly mentioned by Dr. Sadrash, that there is no mention of ICT in all these SDGs and then the talks, the targets. But if you look at them, for example, if you look at target number 4, quality education, of course ICT can help in that. If you look at reduced inequality, of course ICTs can look at that, help in that, because the internet, the technology doesn't discriminate, no matter who is using that technology, it can be used. Sustainable cities, in industry, innovation in infrastructure, decent work, and economic growth. Now, if you look at decent work and economic growth, you have so many other things that comes into play, like digital financial services, and creating jobs using these broadband technologies, and the list can go on. So basically what we have is that we now have to look at if the connectivity part is solved, and I know that it cannot be completely solved. I was talking to another person from a different ministry. Actually, he was the finance minister at that time, and we were talking about having some connectivity in a remote area. He said that those people don't even have drinking water, and you are talking about connecting those people. We should spend this money on providing clean water to those people. Well, at that, I told him that yes, that is also important, but what we need to do is that we need to work in parallel. We cannot just say, okay, till all the problems are solved, I'm not going to give you the broadband. And in fact, the broadband connectivity can help in that issue also. Providing the clean water, you can develop a mechanism of delivery, or even we can have some kind of obligations that whenever you have some kind of telecom infrastructure, you have some facility for the clean water also. And then if you, for example, look at all these other ideas, for example, you look at zero hunger. Can ICTs help in that? Recently, I attended a hackathon, and one of the ideas presented by a startup was to connect all the restaurants in the city and collect all the food that otherwise will go to waste and give it to people who actually are hungry, who cannot afford to buy food for themselves. So it can indirectly help all these people. And in fact, I'll give you one thing that we are trying to do when I go back in the next 1.5 to 2 months, is to have a hackathon around all these SDGs, talk to the startups, because we have a very good startup culture in Pakistan, many incubators, innovations being done by the young people, and ask them to target a specific SDG and work and develop some product for that, some idea using ICTs for that. And if you want to do it, you can say that you heard it at the ISC meeting, and so you can replicate the same. Now the main question is, okay, all these things are there, connectivity, we also have this demand side, and there are so many issues. What about us? What about the regulators, the policy makers? What can we do about the SDGs or about ICTs to bring about a change in the lives of the people? Well, if you look at ourselves, and I think that question that I asked was actually more for myself, how much have we changed over the last 5 years? As the technology is changing, and there is a definitive study, and I think it's by ITU, that the regulators also have to change. And they have generation of regulators also. And currently we are actually into the 5th generation of the regulators. So starting with the first, second, deregulation, the regulation, and then the deregulation. Third one was enabling the regulator, enabling policies. Fourth one was integrated regulation, and now we are into the collaborative regulations. So in fact, have we changed? This is something that actually I've been suggesting on all the fora, that probably we need to have an assessment of ourselves also. Where are we in this whole cycle of change? We would realize if we do that, that actually we have not changed a whole lot. And that's what we need to do. We need to have the bigger picture in mind. Generally what happens is that we get an idea, somebody comes with an idea, they want to implement it. For example, this big data analytics, Rohan is a specialist of that. A company wanted to do that. In fact, they eventually did it, but there were issues saying, no, how can you actually use this data? How can you send this data abroad? Who is going to look at this data? And there were so many issues around that. But finally, we were able to get that study done. It was about the spread of dengue fever in the country. How can you use the CDRs to actually do that? So things like that, if you see, usually what happens is that as regulators, we inhibit the technology. We should be, although we say that we facilitate, but many a times we actually don't do that. However, that's what we need to do. So in our case, we are now working very closely, and there is nothing wrong. And actually, this is another perception in the government departments, that once we were sitting in a meeting and the telecom operators were also there. There were people from the other ministries, and they say, why are people from the private sector sitting in here? And the Secretary Information Technology at that time, who was chairing the meeting, he said, they are part and parcel of our community. They have to be here. So we need to have all these industry players, other sector regulators. That's very important, because ICTs, it has no boundaries. Somebody yesterday, I think it was Rohan, he was telling me that he went to the Pakistan-India border and he was welcomed by the Indian signal, the Indian telecom operator, welcome to India, while he was still in the geographical boundary of Pakistan. So he said the telecom doesn't know the boundaries. Similarly, technology doesn't know the boundary, and with internet, that is even more prominent. Similarly, other platform providers like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others, Line, and you name them, all of us need to work together wherever, I think, and of course, there are many things where we can actually align, and I will be very interested to know about any new initiatives being taken by any of the industry players, and that we can collaborate with. So basically, my message is keep the big picture in mind. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals. Think about what ICTs can do, and then see how we can actually facilitate. So now is our role should be that of a facilitator of collaboration with all the relevant stakeholders.
Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions from the floor, but until I see a raised hand, yes, I do see a raised hand. So Bob Horton, could somebody get a microphone to him, please?
Thank you. Yes, Bob Horton, consultant, but I'm also on the board of the regulator in Papua New Guinea, NICTA. This whole issue of connectivity is of great interest to us in Papua New Guinea. And as Dr. Shah pointed out, connectivity is not just about access, but it also includes affordability, a very important thing in developing countries. And what is it you're connecting people to? The end user, what sort of services, entertainment or government services, etc. So there's a whole complexity in there, but my approach is if we could explore a little bit more of the affordability angle. I noticed Steve Unger did point to a reformulation of the universal access in the UK with an intermediate goal of 10 megabits for every person in the UK. But I was particularly interested in what I heard from Dr. Shadrach, which was about Myanmar and a reformulation of the universal access scheme for Myanmar, learning from the past. So I wonder if you could perhaps indicate what has been learned and what is proposed for a developing country such as Myanmar in terms of how we subsidize affordability and whether it brings in social tariffs as well that they're proposing in the UK, I don't know. It'd be useful to hear from you what is happening from a perspective of a developing country situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Although the process towards creating the Universal Service Fund has begun just a month ago, with the World Bank supporting the government in terms of not only recruiting the consultants who would design this fund, but also an initial fund offered to the government to not just pilot some of the innovative ideas in rural and remote locations, but also as means to demonstrating evidence to what targeted interventions in rural and remote areas could do. As you know, although Myanmar has achieved a lot of success in the last 2 years, a lot of penetration is concentrated in 3 cities, Mandalay, Naypyidaw and Yangon. But when it comes to a number of states in Myanmar, the connectivity is far from wanting. So the opportunity presents through the Universal Service Fund is to experiment with innovative methods of delivering access and services to people in various parts of Myanmar. 2 things probably would be different when it comes to Myanmar designing this fund. The first and the foremost is the decision of how the fund should be utilized is not just in the interest of the industry and the government, but there is a major civil society contribution to the thinking process and the design process of the fund itself, which is probably different from the various USOs that we have seen in the past. The second change that we hope to see in Myanmar is moving away from pilots and remaining in pilots, which is what happened with a lot of USO fund experiments, to something much more concrete that could be carried out as a short-term measure to achieving the long-term goals. We don't foresee, I hope the government also sees the same way, foresee the fund to be the solution to the universal access problems. It's one of the many strategies one would have to put in place, but also we don't foresee the fund to be a permanent fixture, fund to be a kind of a temporary measure that stimulates innovation and new ideas that could be demonstrated in remote and rural locations, but also targeting particularly marginalized communities, women and people in border states. So these 2 perhaps are going to be different, but these are very early days. The consultants have just got in there a month into their job, and they have a contract of 36 months to design and implement and deliver and demonstrate. So we would hope to continue to be in the process of supporting them and ensuring that the fund is designed in a manner that is very different to the funds that have been managed in the past.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'll come with a follow-up question. The idea of universal service funds, of subsidizing, is premised on ICT connectivity being seen as a good thing, as a merit good, as you would say in technical terms. But in so many of our countries, we also see sector-specific taxation, additional taxes, because it is mobile, because it is telecom, not the conventional ordinary taxes that all the goods and services are subject to, but additional taxes, including what I call universal service taxes. This suggests to me that the government is schizophrenic. On one side, it is seen as a merit good, where we should spend either dedicated universal service funds or taxpayer money to promote access. On the other side, we tax it like it's tobacco or alcohol, which is a demerit good. Are there any comments from the panel on this, what I call schizophrenic attitude towards ICTs? Yes.
You had said that you're going to ask me this question because we are not directly dealing with the Universal Service Fund, but I am on the board. It's mainly headed by or managed by a company that reports to the Ministry of Information Technology. But before I answer that, there was one thing that I forgot, one group of individuals that we usually ignore, and you would probably say what has a regulator to do with it, but I think there is a lot that we have to do with them, and that is persons with disabilities. We have taken a few initiatives that I can talk to you about later on, but we have recommended to the government to include them in the policy, for example, making the website accessible and all. Now coming back to the Universal Service Fund, as we were discussing last night also, most of the universal service funds have been underutilized. And one of the main reason has been that there is lots of bureaucracy involved in actually spending that fund. Whatever actually comes to somehow, it may not be directly in the government, but if the government has to do something with it, then there are so many procedures that have to be followed. And it's also subject to so much public scrutiny that even if you want to, it's really very, very difficult to spend this money very, very, very quickly. So there is lots of accumulation and very less spending on that. I think we need to change that a little. And the first step would be to actually reduce the contribution and eventually eliminate it and make it part of the rollout obligation of the operators so that they cover it. For example, it's mainly for the rural areas. And we have in many countries still the lower frequency bands available. So it can be made as an obligation to cover or start from the rural areas. And I think there are examples in Germany where it was done. And then that way you will get less money for the upfront money for the spectrum, but I think the universal obligations will be met in a much more efficient manner. The taxes is really an issue because most of the countries, they think of telecom, at least in this region I would say, not all the regions, and probably they have changed a little over a period of time, but we still expect a big amount of money upfront when we do the auctions. And secondly, the finance ministries, especially, they think of it, and many people who are maybe above 45 or so, they think of internet as a luxury. They don't think of it as a basic human right. They think that this is for the young people who just go on the internet and waste time. So that perception that has to be changed, and for that we need to have this awareness. But till that time, I think these taxes is an issue. Slowly and gradually, at least for example in our case, some of our provinces at least have realized this and they have reduced certain taxes. There is a little awareness that we also need. For example, there is a certain amount of tax which is on the telecoms, which is on every sector, but on telecom also. It is the withholding tax, and you can get it refunded if you are a tax filer. Now, if you don't even fall in the tax bracket, that money goes to the government. So these type of things, awareness and also convincing the government that they don't need to charge withholding tax on a person who actually is not a tax filer or cannot be a tax filer, especially looking at the type of population that we have in rural areas and the difficulties in filing taxes. So yes, these are discriminatory taxes, and not only that, it's also on the import side. When you are importing, when the telecom companies are importing the equipment, they also have to pay these taxes, which is telecom specific. So they need to go away with that, and we have our own recommendation that we are sending to the government.
Yeah, I have a question. If you could introduce yourself, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Namdi Mwokike. I'm from the Nigerian Communications Commission. I just would like to, if you like, rephrase your question as it borders, as it activated my mind. In most developing countries, especially in Africa, we have that issue of dual taxing, if you like. There's a universal service fund established, and a lot of us are agitating for communication tax again. So I don't know what happens in developed countries. I don't know what the Americas, I don't know what Europe has done. Did they have such dual taxing regime or tax regime? And how did they manage it? Or is this something maybe the World Bank is looking at? How do they advise countries within our region how to manage such, I think maybe called dual taxing or multi-taxing for such service? Thank you.
Should I do that, or Natasha, you want to? Basically, just to give a sort of thumbnail history of universal service, the United States has had a long tradition of running extraordinarily inefficient universal service programs. I think about 25% of the money that they collect is just eaten up by administration. Nobody should ever use that as a model. 1990s, up to the 1990s, the favorite model was universal service obligations, which I was a little disturbed to hear Dr. Shah bringing back. These were where the incumbent telcos were told you have to do X and Y because you're the incumbent telco. And it was just one of these endless games where they would be told and they would say why not, and they would be told again and they would say why not. I've sat in on these meetings when I was in government. Then the World Bank and several others took a model from Chile. It was very interesting that it was a developing country where the model came from. A model from Chile where general taxpayer funds were put in to fund universal service, not only in telecom, but also in things like clean water and things of that nature, electricity. And companies were asked to bid for this, so that we were using market mechanisms in order to make the most efficient use of the subsidies that came from general taxation. Now, by the time this got translated into other countries, and the World Bank was behind it, and I was one of its major proponents, because we thought it would become more transparent, rather than this ineffective obligations. Here we would have real numbers. And 10 years of this went on, and in around 2010, 2011, the independent evaluation group of the World Bank assessed all these programs, assessed what we had done with these targeted efforts to provide universal connectivity. They said we had made enormous achievements, but that was through market liberalization and competition, not through the targeted programs, which was a terrible indictment of the Universal Service Fund idea. So these are the lessons that Mr. Bob